Covarrubias, and we filmed in all these places. We actually had a kind of a bizarre...
At 95, Clint Eastwood knows exactly where he stands in life. He's reached that quiet stage where memories get heavier, time feels shorter, and legacy starts to matter more than fame. He's spoken openly about aging, about slowing down, and about taking stock of the people who truly mattered along the way. And somewhere in that reflection came a firm decision. When the time finally comes, there's one person he doesn't want anywhere near his funeral. Not out of drama, not for headlines, just a clear boundary drawn by a man who's had decades to decide who deserves a place in his final goodbye. From Samson to icon, the unfiltered life of Clint Eastwood. At 95, Clint Eastwood doesn't look back with noise or spectacle. He looks back with the calm of a man who has lived several lifetimes in one. And to understand how he arrived at this quiet, reflective stage, you have to start at the very beginning, long before the legend, long before the squint, long before the voice that would one day define American cinema. Clint Eastwood Jr. was born on May 31, 1930, at St. Francis Memorial Hospital in San Francisco. A big baby weighing over 11 pounds, so big that nurses nicknamed him Samson before he had even opened his eyes to the world. His parents, Ruth and Clinton Eastwood, were living in Oakland's Lake Merritt neighborhood at the time, trying to build a steady life during the uncertainty of the 1930s. He would later be joined by his younger sister, Jeanne, and the two of them grew up in a household that kept moving as their father searched for stability, changing jobs and relocating 3 different times before the family finally settled in Piedmont, California. By the time they arrived there, life had improved. The Eastwoods lived in an affluent part of town, complete with a swimming pool and country club memberships, each parent driving their own car, a quiet picture of post-Depression progress. His father worked as a manufacturing executive at Georgia Pacific, and as Clint and Jean grew older, Ruth took a clerical job at IBM. On the surface, it looked comfortable, but comfort never guaranteed direction. School did not come easily to Clint. He struggled academically, was held back, attended summer school, and eventually found himself asked to leave Piedmont High after a string of infractions that included writing an obscene message on the athletic field scoreboard and burning an effigy on the school lawn. It was rebellious, reckless, and maybe even a glimpse of the stubborn independence that would later define him. He transferred to Oakland Technical High School and graduated in 1949, closing that chapter without ceremony. After graduation, he drifted through a string of odd jobs: lifeguard, paper carrier, grocery clerk, forest firefighter, and golf caddy. Nothing glamorous, just a young man trying to find footing. He attempted to enroll at Seattle University in 1951, but life had other plans. He was drafted into the United States Army during the Korean War, and it was during this period that one of the most dramatic moments of his life unfolded. While returning from Seattle as a passenger on a Douglas A-D bomber, the aircraft ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean near Point Reyes. Eastwood and the pilot survived by inflating a life raft and swimming 2 miles to shore. It was the kind of near-death experience that doesn't just fade, the kind that quietly reshapes a man's sense of time and chance. He was discharged in 1953, alive, intact, and perhaps more aware of how fragile everything really is. That same year, he moved to Hollywood. It wasn't an overnight rise. A screen test with Universal in 1954 earned him a 40-week contract, but after a renewal and a handful of bit parts in films like Tarantula and Revenge of the Creature, the studio dropped him. For a while, he floated through minor television appearances, another actor trying not to disappear from the scene. Then, in 1959, Everything shifted when he was cast as Rowdy Yates in the television Western Rawhide. The show ran for years, and America began to notice him. The tall frame, the steady gaze, the quiet intensity. But it was overseas that he became a phenomenon. In the mid-1960s, he traveled to Italy to work with director Sergio Leone on a trilogy of westerns that would later be known as the Dollars Trilogy, a fistful of dollars for a few dollars more, and the good, the bad, and the ugly. In these films, he played the man with no name, a laconic gunfighter whose stillness was more dangerous than any outburst. When the trilogy reached American theaters in 1967, it exploded. Eastwood wasn't just an actor anymore. He was a symbol. He returned to the United States with control in mind. For Hang 'em High, he formed his own production company, Malpaso, a quiet declaration that he would shape his own path. Around this time, he began working closely with director Don Siegel, who became both collaborator and teacher. Their partnership produced films like Coogan's Bluff, Two Mules for Sister Sarah, and eventually the film that would carve his name into cinematic history, Dirty Harry. As Inspector Harry Callahan, Eastwood embodied a new kind of lawman, ruthless, controlled, and morally rigid in his own way. The film's success launched 4 sequels and cemented Dirty Harry as a cultural icon. Lines from the film became part of everyday language. But beneath the tough exterior, something else was happening. Eastwood was studying the camera from the other side. He made his directorial debut with Play Misty for Me, then continued directing while still starring in his own projects. Films like High Plains Drifter and the outlaw Josie Wales revealed a shift. His characters were no longer just mythic avengers. They were wounded men, haunted men. In the outlaw Josie Wales, the revenge-driven farmer carried grief like a shadow. And for the first time, audiences saw vulnerability beneath the steel. Throughout the 1980s, he balanced action films with quieter, more reflective projects. But it was in 1992 that he delivered what many consider his masterpiece, Unforgiven. In it, he played an aging outlaw pulled back into violence, not as a hero, but as a man confronting the cost of who he used to be. The film stripped away the romance of the Old West and replaced it with consequence. It won Academy Awards for Best Picture and Best Director, and suddenly, critics who had once dismissed him began to speak differently. The pattern continued. In Mystic River, he directed a heavy, emotionally raw story about childhood trauma and adult guilt. Then came $1 Million Baby, where he played a weary boxing trainer burdened by regret. The film won Best Picture, and Eastwood earned another Oscar for Best Director. By then, the tough loner image had fully evolved into something deeper. His films weren't about dominance anymore. They were about consequences, about loss, about what remains when pride fades. He continued to explore history and morality in Letters from Iwo Jima, telling the Battle of Iwo Jima from the Japanese perspective, a choice that reflected his willingness to complicate narratives rather than simplify them. Even into his 90s, he refused to slow down creatively. In 2024, he directed Juror No. 2, a courtroom drama centered on guilt and moral reckoning, themes that have followed him for decades. Along the way, he collected honors, the Irving G. Thalberg Award, the American Film Institute's Life Achievement Award, and recognition from France's Legion of Honor. But awards were never the full story. What defined him was endurance, reinvention, the quiet refusal to be boxed in. And now, at 95, when he speaks about aging, about time, about who mattered and who didn't, it carries weight because he has lived through enough chapters to measure them honestly. From a rebellious teenager in Piedmont to a soldier who swam 2 miles to survive, from a struggling contract player to an international icon, from a symbol of cinematic toughness to a filmmaker unafraid of tenderness. Every stage built the man who now draws clear boundaries about his final goodbye. Because when you've spent nearly a century shaping stories about justice, revenge, regret, and redemption, you learn something about the people who belong in the last scene and the ones who don't. The messy, loud, and complicated romantic world of Clint Eastwood. Having been 95 years on this earth, and about 70 of them in the spotlight, it comes as no surprise to fans that Clint Eastwood has a playboy past. Not the made-up, glossy kind either, but the real kind that follows a person for decades, gets stitched into headlines, slips into biographies, and then quietly shows up again every time someone tries to tell his story in a neat, simple line. Because for all the tough guy stillness he perfected on screen, his private life has always been louder, messier, and far more complicated than the character posters ever suggested. On paper, it looks straightforward. The Dirty Harry actor was only married twice, first to Maggie Johnson from 1953 to 1984, and later to Dina Eastwood from 1996 to 2014. But the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes that marriage was only one small part of his romantic world. He has 8 known children with 6 different women, and the connections between them don't unfold like a clean timeline. They overlap, collide, and sometimes sit beside each other in a way that feels almost unreal, until you remember this is Hollywood. And Eastwood wasn't just living inside the industry. He was one of the men the industry was built to forgive. It all starts with Maggie Johnson, because she wasn't just the first wife. She was the original anchor. Eastwood first met Maggie in May 1953, when she was a student at the University of California, Berkeley. That friend set him up on a blind date with Maggie, even though she had a boyfriend, which already tells you what kind of orbit Clint was stepping into. Maggie later remembered coming down the stairs of her sorority house and seeing him with his back turned, and then he turned around, and the moment landed. She recalled being amazed by what he looked like, but it wasn't just the looks that stuck. It was the way he carried himself, understated, quiet, and not begging to be liked. Despite the connection, he was also seeing other people. Before moving to Los Angeles, he fathered a child with another woman in Seattle. Things got serious fast with Maggie. When marriage came up, Clint admitted he was hesitant, but eventually he proposed anyway. They got married on December 19, 1953, and the timing is part of what makes the story so sharp, because only a few months later, his daughter Lori Murray was born and placed for adoption, and at the time, this happened without his knowledge. So even at the moment he's stepping into marriage, there's already another life event running alongside it, unseen, unresolved, and waiting decades to surface. Once they were married, the shine didn't last. Eastwood later called their first year terrible. In the late 1950s, he began an extramarital affair, and in 1964, that affair resulted in his second child, Kimber Lynn. Whether Maggie knew is still one of those gray areas people love to argue about. Their friend Fritz Maines recalled her asking if he thought her husband was playing around. Maines admitted he lied to reassure her. Still, they built a family of their own. Their son Kyle arrived in 1968. Their daughter Allison was born in 1972. By 1979, several years into his affair with Locke, Clint and Maggie officially split. Their divorce was finalized in 1984, and it was widely reported that Maggie received a $25 million settlement. Here's the twist, though. They stayed on good terms. They remained friends. Maggie was even by his side with their children when he was elected mayor of Carmel by the Sea in 1986. Now, while Clint was still married to Maggie, another relationship was happening in the background. He met stunt woman Roxanne Tunis on the set of Rawhide. They began an affair that reportedly lasted 14 years. Tunis became pregnant, and in 1964, she gave birth to Kimber Lynn Eastwood. Eastwood later claimed he didn't know Tunis was pregnant, and he wasn't told about the baby until a year after she was born. He made arrangements to take care of Kimber, but he didn't see her often. Then came Sandra Locke, the relationship that didn't just make noise, it dragged him into years of public speculation, private bitterness, and legal war. The affair began in 1975. In her autobiography, Locke claimed Eastwood told her there was no real relationship left between him and Maggie. Locke also alleged she had undergone abortions and a tubal ligation because Eastwood told her he didn't want any more children. What wasn't disputed was how ugly things became over time. During those same years, Eastwood had other affairs, including with flight attendant Jocelyn Reeves and actress Frances Fisher. In April 1989, it was alleged that Eastwood moved Locke's belongings into storage and changed the locks on their home. Shortly after, Locke filed a palimony lawsuit. The lawsuit dragged on. Meanwhile, she was dealing with breast cancer. In 1990, they reached an agreement. Then came the second wave. 5 years later, Locke sued again, alleging fraud. They settled out of court in September 1996. Locke died in 2018. While he was still involved with Locke, Eastwood met Jocelyn Reeves. In 1986, Reeves gave birth to their son, Scott Eastwood. In 1988, she welcomed their daughter, Catherine. In 1988, Eastwood met Frances Fisher during the lead-up to Pink Cadillac and soon began a relationship with her. They moved in together, and in August 1993, they welcomed their daughter, Francesca Ruth Eastwood. By the end of 1993, the relationship began to dissolve. There was the shock of discovering his children with Reeves. There were paparazzi photos of him kissing another woman. By spring 1995, they were done. Somewhere in that same period, Eastwood met Dinah Ruiz, a news anchor. She interviewed him in 1992. Eastwood later recalled flirting, holding hands, and all the kind of nonsense that feels small until it becomes the beginning of a whole new life. In early 1995, they were photographed kissing at a golf tournament, but they didn't fully become a couple until after he and Fisher had split. Eastwood proposed in September 1995. In March 1996, Eastwood organized a wedding ceremony at his friend Steve Wynn's nearby estate, planned in 48 hours. Soon after, they learned Dinah was pregnant. In December 1996, they welcomed their daughter Morgan. Then, in 2012, their world shifted. Dinah and Morgan appeared on Mrs. Eastwood and Company, a reality show that reportedly infuriated Eastwood. During the show's airing, their marriage began falling apart. Dinah leaned on an old friend, Scott Fisher, for support. Then came the twist that left Dinah stunned. By March, Eastwood and Erica Scott's ex-wife were dating. Dinah eventually filed for divorce. Even then, she urged people not to speak negatively about Clint. In 2016, Dinah married Scott Fisher. Erica Tomlinson Fisher remained a quieter chapter. They began dating in 2013, but never made it public. How it ended is unclear. After Erica, Eastwood found companionship with Christina Sandra. They made their red carpet debut at the Oscars in 2015. In 2018, she appeared with Eastwood and his family, including his children, his granddaughter, and even Maggie Johnson at the premiere of The Mule. And that image tells you everything about how his life settled into something unusual but functional, with all the past and present standing in the same room. Then, in July 2024, Eastwood announced Sandra had died at 61. And whatever you believe about the man, that moment still lands like a quiet closing door. Because when you lay all of this out, it doesn't feel like a simple list of relationships. It feels like a long, winding emotional biography, full of longing, freedom, fallout, and repair. Beyond the squint, the controversies of Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood has been in the icon stage of his Hollywood stardom for a long time. His career has stretched from the 1950s to now, with wins on both sides of the camera. And that kind of longevity doesn't happen by accident. He started out as a working actor, broke through as Rowdy Yates on the hit Western Rawhide, then kept evolving until he became an Oscar-winning director whose films could stir up arguments and still pull crowds. Even his most famous roles feel like two different eras of American cinema. On one side, the man with no name in those spaghetti westerns, the cold, quiet gunslinger who barely spoke, but somehow controlled every frame. On the other hand, Harry Callahan, the San Francisco cop with the .44 Magnum and the hard edge, is a character so huge he carried Dirty Harry and its sequels for 2 decades. And while all of that built the legend, the numbers made it official. Eastwood has been nominated for 11 Oscars and won 4, with Unforgiven and $1 Million Baby both earning him Best Director and Best Picture. And in 1995, he was handed the honorary Irving J. Thalberg Memorial Award, the industry's way of saying, you've become part of the furniture of film history. He even stepped into politics and won, serving a full 2-year term as mayor of Carmel by the Sea, which only added to the mythology because very few stars can walk into a public office and make it feel like an extension of their brand. But the longer someone stays famous, the more the polished story starts to develop cracks. And with Eastwood, the cracks were never exactly hidden. They were just easier to ignore when the movies kept coming and the box office kept agreeing. Because alongside the acclaim, there's always been controversy, and not just the harmless kind. Some of it is old Hollywood behavior that reads differently now. Some of it is the kind of thing that was debated even then. And some of it is the kind of story that keeps resurfacing because it never fully settles. One of the most talked about examples goes back to the late 1960s, when Eastwood had fully graduated from television to film and was making bigger projects, including the 1969 musical Western Paint Your Wagon, where he starred alongside Lee Marvin and Gene Seberg. During that production, Eastwood and Seberg, both married at the time, had an affair while filming on location in Oregon. And according to accounts that have circulated for years, Seberg's feelings ran deep enough that she told her husband, Romain Gary, she was leaving him for Eastwood. The fallout became the kind of story people repeat because it sounds like a movie plot. A husband so furious he challenged his rival to a duel, and the duel never happened, but the mess remained. What makes the whole thing darker is the claim that Seberg believed Eastwood felt the same way, only to realize he didn't. There are accounts that suggest she was devastated when he returned to Los Angeles and essentially cut her off, leaving her stunned that he could be so indifferent. Whether you frame it as cruelty, carelessness, or simply the cold reality of a man who never promised what she imagined, the end result reads the same. Seberg fell hard. Eastwood moved on. Then there's the 1973 Academy Awards moment, the kind of clip that doesn't die because it's simple enough to be understood in seconds. That year, the ceremony was already tense because Native American activist Sachin Littlefeather appeared to decline Marlon Brando's Best Actor Oscar for The Godfather, explaining that he refused the award as a protest against the treatment of American Indians by the film industry and on television, and referencing the events at Wounded Knee. It was a charged moment, one that split the room. Shortly after that, Eastwood came on stage to present Best Picture, and before he did, he made a quick joke that seemed to mock what had just happened, remarking that he didn't know if he should present the award on behalf of all the cowboys shot in John Ford westerns over the years. For decades, it sat in the past. Then years later, it resurfaced online and spread again, partly because the internet has a long memory, and partly because the tone of the joke lands differently when you view it through today's lens. It became one more example people point to when they talk about Eastwood as a figure who often moved through culture without worrying too much about how he sounded while doing it. Another long-running tension in Eastwood's story involves the Western genre itself and the way his version of the cowboy unsettled the older guard. His trilogy with Sergio Leone reinvented the Western, but not everyone admired what that reinvention meant. John Wayne, the symbol of the classic American cowboy, reportedly hated the nihilism in Eastwood's persona and saw it as an insult to everything he thought the Western stood for. The disagreement went beyond taste. It was about mythology, about whether the West should be romantic, heroic, and clean, or grimy, morally blurred, and full of consequences. At one point, Eastwood sent Wayne a script hoping they could star together, and Wayne declined. Eastwood later described Wayne writing him a letter criticizing High Plains Drifter, saying it wasn't really about the pioneers of the West. And Eastwood took it as proof that they were two different generations speaking two different languages. The story is often repeated with a dramatic flourish, Wayne receiving a revised script and throwing it into the ocean, furious that the same piece of script had come back around. And whether every detail is told perfectly or not, the larger point stands. Eastwood didn't just become the new Western star, he became the guy who represented a new Western worldview. And it irritated the men who built the old one. A different story, one Eastwood didn't deny, came through his son, Scott Eastwood, who spoke about what discipline looked like in their household. Scott recalled bringing his younger sister Catherine, who was 14 at the time, to a house party, then leaving her there while he went off with friends. When Clint found out, Scott described his father reacting physically, slamming him against a wall and punching him in the face, delivering what Scott framed as an old-school lesson about never leaving his sister at a party. Scott spoke about it as punishment and responsibility, and he contrasted it with what he called New Age parenting. Even retold in the most careful language, it's still a story about a line being enforced with force, and it feeds into the larger image of Eastwood as a man shaped by another era, one who sometimes carried that era into moments where it didn't belong. At 95, Clint Eastwood named the one person banned from his funeral. Clint Eastwood turned 95 last May, and ever since crossing that line, the tone of his reflections has shifted. When you reach that age, the conversation naturally moves away from premieres and box office numbers and towards something quieter. In July 2024, he lost his longtime partner, Christina Sandera, and that loss seemed to press pause on everything. Since then, he has spoken more openly about how fragile life really is, about how quickly it can tilt, and even about how he would like to be buried as he edges closer to the century mark. There's a calm in the way he talks about it now, but there's also finality. And in the middle of those reflections, Eastwood reportedly made something else clear. When the time comes, there is one person he does not want at his funeral. That person is Spike Lee. To understand why that line exists, you have to rewind to 2006, when Eastwood released two war films back-to-back, Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima. The first told the story of the 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman who raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi during the Battle of Iwo Jima in 1945, a moment immortalized in Joe Rosenthal's photograph and later turned into the Marine Corps War Memorial. Eastwood built an entire film around the weight of that image, around what it meant for the men involved and for the country watching from home. He then balanced that perspective with Letters from Iwo Jima, which told the same battle from the Japanese side. Critics widely considered Letters the stronger film. It earned 4 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture and Best Director, and reinforced Eastwood's reputation as a filmmaker who could handle morally complex material without flinching. But not everyone was impressed. Spike Lee, whose own World War II film Miracle at St. Anna focused on Black American soldiers, publicly criticized Eastwood's omission of Black Marines from Flags of Our Fathers. Lee pointed out that Black soldiers were present at Iwo Jima and argued that their absence from the film amounted to historical erasure. At the 2009 Cannes Film Festival, while promoting his own project, Lee implied that Eastwood had made a version of history where the Black perspective simply did not exist. Eastwood did not take the criticism lightly. In an interview with The Guardian in 2008, he responded by explaining that Flags of Our Fathers was specifically about the Rosenthal photograph and the men who raised the flag in that image. Those 6 men were white, and Eastwood argued he was bound by that fact. If he had inserted a Black actor into the flag-raising scene, he suggested, audiences would have questioned the historical accuracy. He also pushed back against Lee's earlier criticism of Bird, his 1988 biopic about Charlie Parker, arguing that he cast films according to the story being told, not according to external pressure. And in a remark that only added fuel to the fire, he said that someone like Lee should shut his face. Lee, unsurprisingly, fired back. He rejected the tone, saying Eastwood was not his father and they were not on a plantation. He called him a great director, but insisted they simply made different films and suggested that the comment sounded like something an angry old man would say. Lee maintained that he was not inventing history, that he was a student of it, and that Hollywood had long ignored the contributions of over 1 million African American men and women who served in World War II. The feud quickly became public, heated, and symbolic. It was no longer just about one photograph or one screenplay. It was about representation, about who gets to tell which stories, and about how history is framed on screen. Even the title Flags of Our Fathers began to feel loaded. In fairness, there were brief moments in Flags showing Black soldiers in the background, including a shot of a wounded Black Marine being carried from the battlefield. But those glimpses were fleeting, and for Lee, that was precisely the problem. In the end, the fighting got so bad, they needed outsiders to step in. Steven Spielberg, who had produced Eastwood's 2 war films and was also friendly with Lee, reportedly stepped in to cool things down. There's no official transcript of those conversations, but the temperature dropped. The public sparring faded. At one point, Lee even sent Eastwood a future project for a private screening, a small but meaningful gesture that suggested the hostility had softened. They were never close friends. They didn't suddenly align philosophically, but the open war between them quieted. And now, nearly 2 decades later, with Eastwood in his mid-90s, reflecting on life after losing Christina Sandra and speaking candidly about mortality, that old clash still lingers in the background. Not because it defined his career, but because it revealed something about him. Eastwood has always stood firm in his version of events. He doesn't bend easily under criticism. He doesn't rewrite his stance to fit the mood of the moment. So when he draws a boundary about who belongs at his funeral, it isn't random. It traces back to a deeper disagreement about art, history, and identity. At 95, with time suddenly feeling thinner, Eastwood seems less interested in revisiting old battles and more focused on control. Control of his narrative, control of his legacy, control of who stands in the final frame. Because when the cameras stop rolling for good, the only thing left is the story people tell about you. And Clint Eastwood has spent a lifetime making sure he tells his first. What do you think of Eastwood's and Spike Lee's feud? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.